What I'd like to talk about today is kind of to give you a broad context to my book called Total Wars and the Making of Modern Ukraine, 1914 to 1954. And I am very grateful to Frank Sisson and Marta Bojuk for inviting me this afternoon. Before I start, I'd like to say a few words about my mentor at Harvard before Frank became my mentor in many ways, and that is Orest Subtelny, who passed away last year. And I met Orest in 1973 during Harvard Summer School. He was very kind to me, far more so than he should have been. Most importantly, he encouraged me to study the history of modern Ukraine at the graduate level. He wrote many letters of recommendation on my behalf. And I feel, even though he was not my sponsoring professor, that I consider myself as his first PhD student. And I would not be standing here before you without all of his help. So, Wieczna jemu pamięć. I'm really sorry that I don't have the PowerPoint because I have some very nice maps, graphs, pictures, all sorts of stuff. But essentially my talk is not so much about kind of precision of maps or kind of precise points that need to be put on a PowerPoint, but rather I would like to kind of talk about the major themes of my book concerning how and why Ukraine emerged and changed in the course of the 20th century. And I start out my lecture in terms of providing one slide of the map of Europe in 1871 with all of the great empires in Europe, the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, and not to mention on the west side of Europe, the French Empire and the British Empire. Essentially, at the end of the 19th century, it was a world of empires. And then the next slide, which unfortunately is not here, is a map of Europe in 2016, which essentially represents the age of nation states. That is, from 1871 all the way to, say, 2016, the world has changed very, very dramatically, from the age of empires on the one hand to the age of nation states on the other. So the question becomes, what happened? And how do Ukrainians fit into this scheme? So how did we get, or how did Ukrainians get from the 1870s to 2017? Well, much of this, I think, in terms of a broad general context, deals with three issues. I think so, three issues here. That is the issue of unspoken assumptions, ideas as disruptive innovations, and the question of a paradigm shift. And what I'll do over the course of this lecture is to talk about what happens. In terms of unspoken assumptions, we have various elites in these various empires, especially in the Russian Empire, that these elites have bought into the status quo. The status quo, that is, the age of empires, is something that they all consider to be something natural, something that is never going to change, and so why tamper with something which they believe works, and of course, which benefits only them. And of course, underneath these elites, the vast majority of the population consists of the masses, generally peasants, generally individuals who are living in densely populated areas. And of course, the Ukrainian provinces of the Russian Empire were the most densely populated provinces within the Russian Empire. And of course, peasants are exploited. Peasants, even after the emancipation in the Russian Empire in 1861, there's an enormous population growth in the countryside, and the landholdings that most peasants have access to become smaller and smaller and smaller. And so there's an enormous anger over social injustice. So in terms of this, in terms of these unspoken assumptions, and of course many peasants did not necessarily identify themselves as Ukrainians, but many peasants also kind of bought into the status quo. They could not imagine how any of this would change. Well, so this is kind of the concept of unspoken assumptions. And when we look at any historical situation, we need to look at what are the unspoken assumptions of the ruling elites and of the masses. And then we have the concept of ideas as disruptive innovations. Just like inventions like the Apple computer, or the whole kind of invention of personal computers in the 1980s kind of unleashed a kind of a new technological phenomenon which kind of changed how we work and most likely how we also think. Well, so too other ideas had radical impacts in the course in the past. And one of the radical ideas that emerged certainly by the end of the 19th century, is the idea that Ukrainians are not Poles, they're not Russians, that essentially Ukrainians are Ukrainians. And for most people who were Ukrainian speaking at this time, at the end of the 19th century, this was a radical concept that this poor kind of group is very, very different, and most importantly, that this group deserves to have its own independent state. Of course, this idea that Ukrainians should have their own independent state, which was developed by various political parties within the Russian Empire, by the Revolutionary Ukrainian Party in the Ukrainian provinces, and then in Austro-Hungary as well, this idea becomes very dangerous because, of course, this idea means that the making of Ukraine means the unmaking of the Russian Empire as well as the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And of course, this movement, this Ukrainian national movement, was part of a European-wide phenomenon in the course of the 19th century. Ukrainians followed the example of the Poles, the Germans, the Italians, and many, many others. This Ukrainian idea attracted a small group of people at first, that is in small clusters and then in small networks. And of course, this was an age without any kind of major social media that we have today. And of course, it attracted small literate populations. And it was, to a large extent, until the outbreak of the First World War, as Andrew Wilson called it a minority faith. That is, only a small minority of Ukrainian-speaking, primarily intellectuals, became attracted to this idea. But in the course of the war, in the course of the 20th century, what I would argue in my book is that there occurred a major paradigm shift. That is, that this kind of significant minority became a significant majority by the end of the Second World War. And so the question becomes, why this paradigm shift? Why did this happen? And of course, the question appears, what is my thesis? And my thesis is perhaps a simple one, although hopefully not too oversimplistic, in that with the outbreak of the Great War in 1914, European leaders concluded that in an age of mass politics and mass production, that wars would be waged between whole populations, soldier and civilian alike. That is, what the political and military leaders of the major belligerent powers in the First World War initiated, they initiated the first major total war in human history. And this war, and then was followed by several other wars, most importantly, the Second World War. And these total wars overturned the international social, economic, and political status quo and undermined the hegemony of long-standing multinational empires. These wars also accelerated the processes of mass politics, nation building, and state building among groups which did not possess their own sovereign states. And these hostilities, and here I define these hostilities as the First World War, the revolutionary period which quickly followed, collectivization, the famines and the Holodomor, the Second World War, and the immediate post-war period, that these were all part of the total wars of the 20th century, and that each of these total wars had a major impact on Ukraine. And in terms of these total wars, as I point out in my book, I define the First World War and the subsequent revolutionary period, and then the famines and the Holodomor as a second major total war that Ukrainians experienced, and finally the Second World War as the third major total war of the 20th century, which Ukrainians experienced. And what these total wars did, as I argue in my book, they transformed the Ukrainian-speaking populations of East Central Europe into actors, not just objects of their own history. That is, Ukrainians finally became agents of history and not just objects of history. Their responses to this violence, and there's an enormous amount of violence in this, as I recount in my book, and unfortunately I was to show you these statistics on this PowerPoint presentation, but take my word for it, that these responses, the responses of Ukrainians to this violence and their post-war representations of this violence expanded the imagined boundaries of the Ukrainian community. These wars, these conflicts, in short, facilitated the making as well as the remaking of modern Ukraine. These conflicts helped to create Ukrainians. According to an American political scientist, Peter Gourevitch, he emphasized, he wrote about a different context, but he emphasized that, that when crises happen, when he calls them states of emergency happen, they pry open the political scene, throwing traditional relationships into flux. Groups, institutions, and individuals are torn from their moorings, they're torn from their assumptions, their loyalties, their cognitive roadmaps. Circumstances become less certain, and solutions become less obvious. Crises then render politics more plastic. And in this context, what happens is that the impossible becomes the improbable. The improbable becomes the possible. The possible attracts a critical mass and becomes a reality, however fragile in its nature. And so this is what happens with the Ukrainian-speaking provinces of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, as well as the Russian Empire, as a consequence of the First World War. So how did an independent Ukraine emerge over the course of the 20th century? It emerged, I would argue, because of these unprecedented levels of violence that were applied in these Ukrainian-speaking provinces in the First World War, and in the violent conflicts afterwards. These unprecedented levels of violence occurred because of major disruptive events. And of course, wars are major disruptive events. The First World War was a major disruptive event. The Holodomor, or the war against Ukrainian peasants, is also a major disruptive event, as well as the Second World War as kind of the third major disruptive event. And in terms of these disruptive events, different responses emerge to these disruptions. That is, different parts of the Ukrainian community, different groups within the Ukrainian community, and in different regions, other national groups in Ukraine create a response to this violence. And that is governments, and of course in all of this, there are these various governments that that vie for power. Governments friendly to the Ukrainian idea, however few, and governments vehemently opposed to the Ukrainian idea, however many. And in terms of all of this, there's an international recognition. There's the question of international recognition. Because as we follow what's happening in Catalonia today, that so far, despite the Declaration of Independence of Catalonian independence on Friday, no other country, and I was watching CTV yesterday, including the Canadian government, has recognized the legitimacy of an independent Catalonia. So international recognition is very, very important when countries declare their independence, because if they don't receive it, they are not necessarily viewed as equals in the international community. And I'll get back to that in a few moments. So I'm very sorry I don't have kind of all the slides to give you the precise statistics in terms of the unprecedented levels of violence. But in terms of the First World War, about 1.3 million people on the territory of Ukraine perished. In the period, in the revolutionary between 1917 and 1921, according to the Institute of Demography in Kiev, another 2.3 million people perished. During the Holodomor, somewhere between 4 to 4.5 million Ukrainians perished as well. And in the course of the Second World War, somewhere between 6.5 million to 8.1 million Ukrainians perished in the course of this war. So if you kind of add up these various numbers, to make a kind of a quick approximation, about 15 million Ukrainian or people living on the territories of Ukraine, in the majority Ukrainian-speaking territories of today's Ukraine, perished as a consequence of these total wars. And of course, these wars brought not just the application of enormous amounts of violence and the deaths and the wounding of, the physical wounding of millions of people, but this violence also brought long-term trauma, which does not heal quickly or easily or necessarily in one generation. So these are the consequences of the kind of the physical consequences of these total wars in the first half of the 20th century. Well, that's this disruption was unprecedented. That is, as these conflicts broke out, whether the First World War or the forced collectivization of Ukrainian villages or the outbreak of the Second World War, there's a collapse of political authority. That is, there's a breakdown of various coordinating institutions which hold society together. Institutions such as the market system, the transportation system, the food supplies which which should flow on a regular basis. But most importantly, common norms of behavior also begin to disappear in these moments of grave disruption, primarily because everyone now has to save himself or herself, if not their families. So there's a breakdown of community, and of course, all of this disruption leads to uncertainty. And uncertainty is a very much an integral aspect of all of these total wars in the first half of the 20th century. It's something that many historians don't like to talk about because it's kind of touchy-feely and quite murky, but in all sorts of these political and social crises in the first half of the 20th century, there's this enormous confusion that occurs when wars break out, when occupation powers come in, and the question is, what's going on? I mean, this is the $64,000 dollar question. What's going on? There's an enormous lack of clarity, there's enormous confusion. And people are confused because their kind of normal way of operating, their standard operating procedures are in grave doubt. New people come in, there are new rules that need to be followed. It's unclear how these rules will be applied. It's quite arbitrary in many respects. And of course, individuals and groups often lose control of their environment. They feel an overwhelming sense of powerlessness. Who's in charge? Oftentimes, in the midst of war or conflict, it's very, very unclear. And of course, in terms of this uncertainty, each individual must decide if a sovereign authority can prevail, if the new people who are coming into one's city or village can they maintain themselves over the long run? And if you don't think that these people have a future, then what competing group are you going to give your allegiance to? And you might ask, well, why do people think this way? Well, it's because in all of these modern conflicts, all of the belligerents, when they come from the outside, they force people to take sides. They force people to confirm their loyalty and identity in public. Because if they don't affirm their loyalty and identity in public, it's unclear where they stand. So individuals must make choices in order to reestablish a new normal, a new certainty, because everybody wants some sort of predictability. In terms of the fourth point, on how an independent Ukraine emerged over the course of the 20th century, unfortunately, I don't have my PowerPoint here. And in terms of not having my PowerPoint, I could not share with you this shocking photograph that I showed, that I included, and that is, it was a picture of Muhammad Ali, who passed away last year. And in terms of this, I would say I wanted to make a digression, and let me make a digression, because I'm talking about international recognition. Because as the Catalan independence movement is discovering at this point in time, that if you don't have international recognition, you have a serious problem. In terms of this digression about Muhammad Ali, in February of 1964, the boxer Cassius Clay changed his name to Muhammad Ali, and he embraced the Nation of Islam. Ali considered the name Cassius Clay to be a slave name, and he became angry when people used it to address him after he changed his name. But the New York Times and almost every other newspaper in the United States did not recognize Ali's name change until the early 1970s. So about 8 to 10 years passed before mainstream newspapers, including the New York Times, would use Muhammad Ali to identify this boxer. The editors of all of these journals wanted to keep him in a box. Cassius Clay was a fighter, Muhammad Ali, a man. For these editors, Ali the man was invisible. Well, until 1917, Ukrainians in the Russian Empire also wore the cloak of invisibility, officially denied that they differed from the Russians. So imagine millions of people living in their own homeland being told that they are invisible, that they do not count, and that they could not mobilize politically as Ukrainians. In an age of democracy, nationalism, and mass politics, this is what the early 20th century was all about, many Ukrainians wanted to become visible men and women. Many wanted to overcome their powerlessness to find dignity and respect. Many found their national and social and political voice during the First World War, and especially during the revolutionary period. And hence, there was a surge toward independence after the collapse of the Tsarist regime in 1917. Well, independent states do not live in isolation. They live in a community of nation states. Once the Ukrainians established the Central Rada and the West Ukrainian National Republic, they competed for international recognition. Germany and the Central Powers recognized an independent Ukraine at the first Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in February of 1918. But the Allied powers did not participate in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. They did not recognize Ukrainian independence, And of course, the primary reason for this is because they wanted to maintain the Russian Empire. The Central Powers, that is, those powers which recognized Ukrainian independence in February of 1918, lost the war about 7 months later, and there was no support for Ukraine among the victors, that is, the United States, France, or Great Britain. So, as a consequence of this non-recognition of Ukrainian independence, the newly formed Soviet Russia, Poland, Romania, and Czechoslovakia carved up Ukraine. No one wanted an independent Ukraine. And even after Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, there was no independent Ukraine. And so finally, in 1991, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, an independent Ukraine finally emerges, recognized by the great powers, including Boris Yeltsin's Russian Federation. But let's turn back to 1945, to the 1945-1991 period. And here, in showing a map of what post-war, post-1945 Ukraine looked like, that is, it included all of the territories that had been part of interwar Poland and interwar Romania and interwar Czechoslovakia, and this now constituted an enlarged Soviet Ukraine. And of course, Ukraine also experienced in the first years after the Second World War massive population transfers of populations, Polish populations to Poland from Ukraine, and Ukrainian populations in Poland to Ukraine. But after 1945, Soviet Ukraine did not follow in Poland's footsteps. That is, Soviet Ukraine after 1945 did not become a nationally homogeneous entity. It remained a nationally diverse but regionally homogeneous republic. In the post-war period, in the period after 1945, it contained 5 different regions. It contained the West Ukrainian territories, those areas that the Soviet Union had acquired from Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Romania between 1939 and 1945, which became more Ukrainian demographically. That's the first set of Ukrainian territories, the western ones. Then there's central Ukraine, that is, in the central agricultural regions under Soviet control since 1920. The percentage of those who identified themselves as Ukrainians also increased between 1939 and 1959. But the third and the fourth and the fifth regions, that is the industrial eastern and southern regions, as well as Crimea, became for the most part more Russian. As the Soviet authorities reconstructed one of the major industrial heartlands of the Soviet Union after the Second World War, they transferred many Russians and Russified cadres to Ukraine's eastern and southern regions. The wars, revolutions, and major social engineering projects in the first half of the 20th century transformed Ukraine from a multicultural, multinational, and multi-confessional region into a bicultural Ukrainian and Russian state. So Ukraine's western, central, eastern, and southern territories established different clusters of tipping points needed to maintain the Ukrainian language and culture or to abandon it. These demographic changes and the introduction of new institutional arrangements provided a limited social and political menu. The masses could make choices after 1945, but only from the list that the Soviet authorities had provided them. With Gorbachev's reforms in the late 1980s, the citizens of Ukraine regained their voice and chose to exit the USSR. So, in conclusion, what made modern Ukraine, what helped make modern Ukraine in the 20th century? Unprecedented violence, disruption, different responses to this disruption, and international recognition, or lack of international recognition. And over a 40-year period, the people living in the contiguous areas that became Ukraine experienced constant mobilizations and demobilizations and a long continuum of mass violence, which decimated entire generations of young men and killed enormous numbers of civilians. In addition to these losses, the people of Ukraine also experienced massive evacuations and forced population transfers to Siberia, Central Asia, and to the Far East. Many, but not necessarily the majority, ever returned. Each of these major turning points produced widespread psychological unmoorings as people lost their place in the world and desperately fought to find a sense of certainty as well as security. Each of these catastrophes triggered different internal as well as international responses. The continuous violence of the two world wars and the period between the First World War and the Second, especially the Holodomor, transformed the Ukrainian-speaking population of East Central Europe into self-conscious Ukrainians. Wars, mass killings, and forced modernization drives made and remade Ukraine's boundaries, institutionalized its national identities, and pruned its population according to various state-sponsored political, racial, and social ideologies. In short, the two world wars, the Holodomor and the Holocaust, played critical roles in forming today's Ukraine. At the same time, each of these conflicts helped to create fault lines in Ukrainian society, fault lines which divided Ukrainian society before the outbreak of the Euromaidan revolution. Thank you.